Hello, my name is David Santiana, and I'm making this video for Communications 3260, where I'm going to be talking about the three TED Talks that were listed on our discussion about narrative paradigms. The first video listed is by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, and she does her TED Talk about a very interesting phenomenon where she kind of analyzes stereotypes and stories at large. She talks about her experience growing up in Africa and how it shaped her narrative of her country and her continent and the people that live in her country, and also the world around it. So she goes into this conversation about how essentially one story can often be the defining narrative in a thing in general. So, how people will hear one story about something, and if it is the most powerful um, thing that they have to describe what that story is about, how that one story will ultimately come to define it in a very bizarre kind of way. So, the example that she gives is how when she came to the United States, she kind of had a culture shock where she was actually very well versed in kind of Western and European culture, and she sort of expected the same to be true about the Americans that she was interacting with. She gave a very powerful example about um, how people would kind of make assumptions about her entire life, how she grew up, and what her culture was like, and what the society is like at large. So not only did people meet her with assumptions already made about her life, but about all of the lives of all of the people that she grew up around, and how that's actually more of a problematic place to approach something than with just no knowledge at all. And she goes on to explain how this is essentially not a problem with the stories that are told, but a problem with not enough stories being told. When we think of an American, maybe some things come to mind, but there's no one single story that defines an American, or maybe one single story that defines um, a white person. How being American or being a white person is just kind of seen as being a person, and how to get back to the example that I was going to bring up, how she wouldn't watch or read the book American Psycho and somehow come away with this conclusion that all young Americans are psychopaths. But she essentially is very baffled by how the opposite isn't true, and how essentially people will hear one story about Africa and then kind of ignore the rest. And what that does is that adds to this structure that dehumanizes all of the people that live on this continent. And how that one simple oversight can be the foundation for extremely problematic views. And so that was really interesting, and it made me reflect on kind of humanity in general, about how uh, there are stereotypes all over the place, and how those stereotypes are an extremely narrow view on something, that it's more negative to hold that as your placeholder than it is to just not really have an opinion at all. So, the next video actually touched on Chimimanda's story. It was a different TED Talk by Gretchen Busel. And Gretchen Busel talks about the kind of structure of stories and how they exist in relationship to the world and how we make sense of the world. Gretchen talks about there being two types of narratives. Or two types of paradigms. There's the narrative paradigm, where we just create a story just to have a story, because it is so fundamental to how we communicate and how we think. So the narrative paradigm is essentially something that just organically arises and is really cemented in stories in general. Then she talks about the rational paradigm, which is kind of this theoretical paradigm built on logic and evidence and things that have actually happened. And how these two are kind of at conflict sometimes. And she says that we approach stories with a catalog of other stories that we are already familiar with, and how we judge stories based on how they reflect our values that we've been told. And so she makes a point that not only is it interesting that this is essentially how advertising is so effective, because it plays on stories that you're already familiar with, but it also explains a lot of events that have happened. And essentially she says that how if you hear a story, aka something that happened, you are actually extremely likely to reject it if it simply doesn't add up to your values or stories that you've already heard. So I thought that was really interesting, because obviously we want things to reflect our values, but it's not just something that we get to pick and choose. There is a rational paradigm. There's a actual logical evidence-based turn of events that have happened, and how we can either accept that or not. And it's extremely important whether we accept it or not. And so that, what Gretchen spoke of, really makes you think about the foundations on which we judge stories in the first place, and how the values that we hold can actually be one of the reasons that we turn a blind eye to so many stories. And I thought that that was really interesting. And she urges people to be deliberate about the narratives that they tell and the narratives that they accept. And then the next video that we watched was by Baratunde Rafik Thurston. And he had some very interesting insights on how stories work himself. He says that he got into researching stories by researching the inequality of Black people in the United States, and how looking into the inequality actually turned into looking into how sentences are structured in the first place. I thought that was extremely interesting, because you wouldn't think that they're related: sentence structure and police brutality. They shouldn't really interfere with each other. But Baratunde says that the narratives that are told about police brutality are where some of the issues come from. He kind of dissects and analyzes the stories where there is a subject, an action, a target, and an activity. And how if all of police reports are presented this way, then who is the subject? And in all of the police reports or all of the headlines, the subject is almost always white people, not which does not depict the entire story. The entire story is white people, black people, police officers, victims, and honestly just regular people doing regular things. He points out that this is extremely problematic because when you make a white person the subject of the story, you are really painting a poor picture of how something actually happened. And essentially, what he says is that by analyzing these stories and how they're told, he is able to realize that the problem is the action that is taken in the story, and how the action that's taken is actually dependent on the target. So he points out that calling the police is actually what should not be happening, but whenever a black person is involved, calling the police is typically what happens. And furthermore, that when you present the story over and over again about a white person calling the police on a black person, there is it reinforces the action of calling the police, and it doesn't address it. And he thinks that it's extremely important to address the action that the white person took. This is actually really interesting because it broadens the event into not just this white person was a problem, it was this white person was in a system where calling the police is just the default action to take. So I thought that that was very interesting because it kind of calls into question how do we react when we see these kind of headlines. When we see these headlines, white person calls police on black person, we will typically think, wow, that white person was wrong to call the police in that scenario. And then sometimes we might just say, well, if I'm ever in that scenario, I won't call the police. And he actually goes on to kind of clarify that calling the police shouldn't really even be the problem. In fact, calling the police should be what the article is about and how that was the problem in that scenario. And so I thought those were all very interesting TED Talks, and it taught me a lot about kind of how we approach narratives from other people's perspectives and how we account information from lots of different places to build a coherent story.